My name is Miroslav Bojic, or Miro. I'm an interaction designer at Sencha, and in the next hour, I'm going to talk basically about design and about designing apps for a multi-device world. And I would like to apologize for the really silly Lord of the Rings reference in the title there, but I thought that would draw in the crowd, and it seems. Just to start out, I'm wondering how many people in the crowd are designers? And how many are developers? And how many are both? Okay, that's a decent balance there. So when we talk about designing for multi-device world, of course, we are talking about responsive design. So a majority of this presentation, I'm going to give my thoughts about responsive design. And it's something that many times when you ask people, so what is responsive design and how do we enable an app to be mobile, to work on mobile just as well as on desktop, people think it's just some kind of a plugin or a setting that you very quickly turn on and suddenly everything magically works everywhere. But any developer will tell you in practice this is not just as easy. And also from design point of view, as a designer, you should be aware that you cannot just easily take anything and convert it from one particular device and screen size to something else and have it work in a decent way for the user. So basically, I'm going to go over a couple of things. First of all, why do we need responsive design at all? When is it a good idea to design an application responsively? Because there are also situations when sometimes you would like to decide to just develop two separate applications for mobile and for desktop. And there are situations also when you shouldn't do this. And finally, we're going to talk about, how do we go about designing an application responsively? What kind of guidelines, what kind of tips can we rely on to get us there? So let's start out with why responsive design. So let's say about 10 years back, maybe late 90s, early 2000s, if you're designing any kind of web application, this was basically who you are designing for. Majority of people who had internet access in those days were running a desktop computer, running Windows, and were in all probability browsing with Internet Explorer. So your design space was pretty much cut out for you. You just needed to support this one particular set of things, and you'll be pretty good. But in 2015, we have to deal with a bunch of very, very different things. We still have desktops and laptops, of course, but then we also have to deal with various tablets, with smartphones, and then there are these things that are also like a crossover, like Windows Surface, which is not neither a tablet nor a laptop, but somewhere in between. It has capabilities of both. Then, if you look beyond that, we even have things like e-readers that are also internet capable. Your users might use one of those to access your website or application, or try at least. And in the last year, we've been hearing more and more also about devices like this, smartphones or wearables, I want to say smartwatches, or wearables that quite possibly will also be running some kind of applications that might share some underlying structure with your desktop or mobile application that you built before. On top of this, we also have to deal with a bunch of different operative systems, just Linux in itself is also tons of different distributions. And of course, Android is a big player, which complicates things a lot. And once you have a user, you know what kind of device he's using, what kind of OS he's using. He can also be using any of big browsers that are currently out there, which also all have their own quirks and perks, basically. So we have this huge range of devices and OSs and browsers that we're designing for. And just to give you an overview, if you take just one aspect of this, screen sizes, this is like a quick approximation of what's out there right now. Like if we start with the older smartphones, we're dealing with very, very tiny screens, which are like 320 by 240, and then high-end laptops have resolutions and screen sizes which are in far excess of what full HD resolution is. And I didn't even include like 4K resolutions that are coming up and that are going to be widely available maybe in a year or two. And this is the first part of it. Most of these devices, of course, have a portrait view as well. So when we are designing an application to fit in a screen, we need to think not just about all these various screen sizes, but also the various aspect ratios. So we have portrait and landscape, but also between these, as you can see, there's tons of variations going on. We have any kind of aspect ratio between like 16 by 9, which is like typical widescreen that comes from TV standards, to even 1 by 1 aspect ratio that some BlackBerry devices have. And then, aside from aspect ratios and screen sizes, there's something like the actual pixel density. When we're talking about full HD resolution, for example, we can have a 60, 70, 90-inch TV that has full HD resolution and very, very low pixel density, while at the same time we're fitting the exact same resolution in a tiny 5-inch screen on your mobile phone. This doesn't mean that you can take the exact same interface on both screens, although the number of pixels is exactly the same, because the smaller screen will limit with what you can interact with. This also has benefits. Everybody knows, like on Retina screen, everything looks super crisp and precise. So that can help you also design more beautiful things. So this is various screen sizes in the devices. And then there are also a plethora of ways how we can interact with all these devices. That goes from old-style interaction like keyboard and mouse to all kind of variations on touch interaction, which is just single touch or multi-touch or stylus or a touchpad gesture or not gesture enabled. And all these have very different preciseness and context of use. So when designing an application, for example, a laptop that's touch-enabled, you cannot design it in the same way as you're designing for a laptop that's going to be mainly used with the mouse. You cannot create the buttons the same size if you lack that precision that you have with the mouse but don't have it when you're touching. So I also want to make a note, like responsive design mainly comes from the web world. It's basically attempting to address a problem that, like I mentioned before, we're dealing with this multitude of browsers and internet-capable devices. But I really think it goes beyond the web. Like if you even look at devices that are available within a single, if you're developing a native application on a single platform, like for example for iOS, you already have to deal with a bunch of different aspect ratios, screen sizes, but also immediately context of use. Like a smartphone, someone will use while he's on the go, and he'll use it with probably just a thumb while walking towards his car or something like that. While a bigger tablet like this is probably used with both hands, people use gestures much more. They're seated in their sofa at home. So that changes also how people look at the application. It's not like if you want to do responsive design, it's not just the idea that you create, let's say, an interface that you deploy on the phone and you just stretch it over so it fits on the iPad, because that's a waste of space that you could have used for something better, because people also use it in different contexts and they have more time to interact with it in a different way. And this is just iOS. If you're talking about Android, then we have to deal with tons and tons of more devices as well. Another note I wanted to make is, so responsive design versus accessibility. Because both are basically, it's the idea that you bring the user interface to a wider audience so everybody can interact with it and the interaction is equivalent for all the people, right? but they are addressing basically two sides of a problem. Accessibility is mainly trying to address, to adapt UI in such a way to the user so it kind of resolves the things that the user lacks to interact with it properly. While with responsiveness, we try to transform UI in such a way to accommodate for things that are different or lacking in a device that the user is using. So one is really technology-oriented, while the other one is user-oriented. Accessibility also aims to maximize the inclusiveness, so like make all people able to use an application no matter what might be their impediment, while responsiveness is you are trying to maximize the context of use. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to create a user interface that works for a certain set of devices or OSs if like nobody will ever be using it that way. Like maybe I don't need to have my database access on my smartphone because the screen is just too small. I will never want to use that. Then you don't need to spend time designing that in the first place. And then accessibility, of course, has been around for much longer. There's tons of guidelines and standards. So you basically do have a checklist that you can go off and see if you're supporting everything that you need to support. While responsiveness is still, it's a relatively novel concept, and there's a lot of, it's a big buzzword, there's a lot of talk about it, but there's not like a set of design principles that you can just follow, like a cookbook. This is the way how to do it, and then we'll get to the correct result. So to recap, why do we need responsive design? Because we have to deal with different platforms, OSs, and device performance, and we want to make it work for all of these. And all of these come with different screen sizes and aspect ratios and pixel densities. And finally, because we have to accommodate for different input methods as well. So this being said, let's design responsibly. But let's double check for the situations when we are deciding when we're kind of deciding what our target audience is and what kind of application we are building. We should decide whether we need to build it responsibly or not. And that depends a lot about context of use. So as an example, who out here commonly uses a train or public transportation? So this kind of application would come handy. Let's talk about, for example, we decided to build a train application that kind of gives you the schedule about when the trains are coming and that kind of things. So this kind of application would be used in two major contexts. The first one would be when I'm planning a trip. So I want to go somewhere by train tomorrow. So I log in on the website and check like when are my trains arriving, when is my connection, what's the layover time, do I need to reserve a ticket, and that kind of things. And the second context is basically when I'm already on the station and I'm waiting for the train and train is just not coming and I want to know when is it coming, how long do I need to wait, and I would be checking this on my mobile phone. Probably I won't be opening my desktop and trying to find a Wi-Fi connection or something like that. So this seems like it's a perfect example where we should build a responsive app, right? We have two different contexts, but both contexts people require information about trains. So the app should work on both desktop and mobile. But if we look a little bit deeper, so what kind of information are we looking for in these two different contexts? So in the first context, when I'm planning a trip, I require kind of a static information. I require the schedules as they have been set by the train company. I require some kind of algorithm, search algorithm that can find what's the best ticket price or what are my connections to plan my trip in the most efficient way. On the other hand, when I'm on the station, usually this kind of information is not that necessary. What I really need is live information about where the train is currently positioned, how many more minutes do I need to wait, if the train is overcrowded maybe, or if an accident happened, train's not coming at all. This is completely different information structure that needs to be fed into the system than in the first case. So more and more, we start to think maybe these two applications are actually completely separate. And maybe the optimal case would be to develop a separate mobile application from a desktop application, because also the information structure behind is completely different. But then there's such a thing as cost versus benefit. Because in many cases, with many projects, there's a certain budget and delivery time, and then you need to decide, so okay, maybe two separate apps would be ideal solution. But what would be, or let's say, how much would the user lose if you just design an application responsibly instead and provide the same information on both channels that might, you might lose out in some context what the optimal situation would be, but you would save so much in development costs that it would warrant that, at least in the first instance. There are also situations when you might decide not to build a responsive app at all. So for example, let's talk about a hospital, and they have tons and tons of patient records, and they decide to put it all in a system and digitalize it, and basically have their employees have access to these patient records online. Is this an application that you would want on your mobile phone? This is like patient-sensitive data. You don't want to be sitting somewhere in a restaurant while someone's looking over the shoulder of the nurse who's checking what your, I don't know, blood test results are, and maybe like writing the data down, or there's security issues. And there's also, again, context of use, like what kind of message do you want to send these employees that are working at the hospital? Maybe, if you allow them to work from a mobile device or from home, you're kind of telling them, hey, you should actually work more than you are actually working at work already. And there might be some, for example, hospital managers or surgeons that require this information on the go. But if these are only like 2 or 3 people out of hundreds that work there, then again, cost versus benefit comes into play. And you might say, like, it's just not worth it to build just for these 3 people. Let's just stick with the desktop application in this case. So once again, to recap, when is a good case to build a responsive app? So that will be when you have a solid common context between mobile usage and desktop usage, when your development cost is significantly lower than when you would be developing the separate app, or cost versus benefit warrants that. And finally, that's actually the third things that I want to say. So once we went over all these things, we get to the step, so how to design responsively. And this is perhaps the most difficult thing. Like, as a designer, you need to look at all these things, all these devices, all these operating systems and browsers, and come up with design that will work across all these devices and provide really, really good user experience. Because the moment user experience is bad, you're losing your customers and your users. So one of the major things to do this, and I'm pretty sure you heard this many times before, is to design mobile first. Why is this important? So when you're designing mobile first, you usually have to begin designing an application which needs to fit on a small device, which has limited processing power, limited screen size, fuzzy interaction with fingers touching everything. So that really forces you to think, how can you simplify the user interface to the bare necessity? How can you minimize everything, come up with a minimum viable design? And it's always easier to scale this like minimum viable case up when you move to desktop, rather than create a full-blown app with multiple screens and multiple interactions available on every single page, and then try to cram it all into your little device. going mobile first will also force you to think about your content priority. And this is very important. When you prioritize, like what are the first things that the user needs to see, and especially because interactions on mobile device tend to be extremely short or interrupted by many other things, while on desktop they tend to last longer, you need to basically pick your battles. You need to decide what the user sees when he logs in for those 20 seconds that he logs in for. And this will again translate in a positive case to how you present your content also when you move from mobile to desktop. And finally, the third one is performance. Because you have, like I said, limited performance or in general, slower performance on mobile devices than desktop devices. That means that from the beginning, you really need to start optimizing your application to work perfectly on mobile device. And once again, when you move from mobile to desktop, you already have application that works fast, rather than creating a big application that works fine on desktop and then figuring out how to optimize it down so it performs well on mobile as well. And all of this, or why are you doing all of this? I would say this is basically to avoid tediousness in interaction when you interact with a mobile device. I mentioned just a moment before, when you're interacting with an app on a mobile device, technically your interactions are very, very short. And people generally don't have patience to wait for 15 seconds until something happens or to find that particular little button that they need to press. And anything that's tedious, that's going to slow you down interacting, finding what you're trying to find, basically means that people just close it, uninstall it, or go to another website, or basically stop interacting with it. So doing something like this, like technically this application loads fine in mobile, it works, you can interact with it, but it's not optimized for mobile. Developers probably did just the bare minimum so it loads properly there. And using this in practice would be extremely tedious because you would have to zoom in for every single link, and there's just too much information, many different things. UI is too small, UI is too deep. That's another thing that can happen when you're transferring an interface from desktop to mobile. That means that you will create basically interaction that you need to go deep into the screens to reach the information that you're trying to find, rather than having it available quickly. Sorry. And finally, when you're presenting information that's too rich or too complex, like in the example that I have shown you, that doesn't allow the user to absorb it very quickly. He needs to spend a lot of time reading and going over all of the things that are presented there. While when we are on the go, we just require information that we're looking for very, very quickly. We need to find it right away. So I already kind of mentioned this. One of the big differences how you're designing for a mobile device versus how you're designing for a desktop device is that your interface is going to have more depth on mobile generally, and it will be more broad, more wide on desktop. So your application on a desktop might look something like this. You might have like a main menu and a form and a grid displaying some kind of information. And top menu, basically, you're switching between different parts of application and navigating through the structure. And there's something like a state indication. So the current tab that you have selected is colored. That indicates this is the state in which you are currently. So on a mobile device, you generally don't have that much space. So you would have more something like this. So on the first screen, you would still see the grid, but you wouldn't see all the extra information that you could fit there. And there's no state indication. Instead, we're working something like more with breadcrumb structure. You need to go into the menu. So the menu is overlaid, so you kind of need to keep thinking, where have you been, where are you coming from, where are you going? But you should always pay attention not to make this interaction too deep, because you don't want to end up with kind of structure where you go very, very deeply into the application to reach the information that you're looking for. because once again, this becomes very tedious and users don't really want to interact with something like this. There are a couple of practical tips that I also wanted to add about designing and also a little bit about implementing responsive design. So when you're working on your UI design, when you're deciding where all the elements should go and on which screens are they going to be applied, it's very important to think about breakpoints. So breakpoints are not like the debugging breakpoints. Breakpoints are the places or the rules that detect when your component or view or your interface needs to switch from looking one way to looking another way. So this would be like things that, let's say, for example, if screen is wider than 600 pixels, you should switch from mobile view to desktop view. But it's usually not that simple, and that's because of all those reasons that I mentioned before. The screen sizes are also oriented differently, and we have different pixel density. A small screen might have higher resolution than a big screen. You should always try to use relative positioning and sizing as much as possible. This is very tricky one. I find this one actually very difficult myself when I'm designing things. Because why you should do this? Because you can do pixel precise design that will fit on every single screen. When you're doing that, you're creating one design that will be perfect on one kind of screen and will look crappy on everything else. But you need to think about relations in where you position the element. How is this going to space when you scale up one side or other side of the screen? How are things going to be positioned? Is there still going to be coherence in the things on the screen, or are they still telling the same story or not? And one last important one is scalable graphics. So because we are dealing with screens like Retina screens and regular screens and everything in between, there are different pixel densities. And very quickly, if you're using the standard pixel density resolution, so 72 dpi, you will notice that all your graphics, all your icons look pretty horrible on high resolution screens. So wherever possible, you should stick with using SVGs or vector images, or using high resolution graphics to accommodate for high pixel density screens. Also, I wanted to mention a couple of things. So this morning on the keynote, EXT6 was kind of announced, and you guys got a preview of a couple of features, one of which was that you'll be able to deploy the same application on both desktop and mobile while building it once. And so XJS 6 will have some support for responsiveness in that way. And that comes in a couple of different flavors. So there are two toolkits. One toolkit is optimized for desktop, while the other one is optimized for mobile. And you can switch with these while keeping your data structure and everything completely the same. So when you're building an application after you created it, you can basically decide which toolkit is being used for what deployment. If you basically you will compile your app through such command and then get two versions. One will be optimized for mobile, one will be optimized for desktop, or however you configure your device profiles. You might have a specific build just for, I don't know, Samsung S3 or something like this. And then finally, there are responsive configs, which can be applied to views or to components, which will help during runtime decide how this application will change its looks depending on whether the viewport size was modified or it was opened on a different device. And responsive configs come, once again, in a couple of different flavors. So there's a responsive config property, and I'll give a couple of examples for all of these. And the responsive config property also supports various conditions that help you basically define those breakpoints that I was mentioned earlier. And finally, if these things are not enough, you can define your own responsive formulas, which you can make as detailed as you want, basically defining either the various properties or various viewport configs that you need to look at to decide how your component is behaving, or even use some kind of functions or code to make a more informed decision. So responsive config, that looks something like this. Basically, you can define basically condition saying if height is smaller than 400 or height is larger than 400, you should use layout HBox or layout VBox. So in this case, if you imagine an application which has some kind of a menu structure, and that menu is oriented horizontally, if the screen is larger than 400, it would switch to a vertical ordering of elements. So in that case, you can adopt your menu to be responsive. The responsive conditions that you can use, oh, I see. I didn't intend this. There are a bunch of them. So tall, wide, landscape, portrait, all of these help you detect what kind of screens you're dealing with. But you can also test for platforms. So you can apply, for example, specific UI properties if you're dealing with Android or iOS device, or maybe a Windows device or something like this. And finally, with responsive formulas, if these are not enough for you, you can define your own conditions. So we can define something like small screen or big screen, depending on what kind of width and height are we detecting, and then we can use this keyword in our responsive configs further. Or we can even write a function to check whether a device is touch capable, and depending on that, then later we can include some kind of plugins or I don't know, different behavior to accommodate for that. So you would be using responsive formula something like this. You would include it in the config, and then if you're detecting this is a touch device, we would add interaction, which is pan zoom. So basically, in this case, if you're panning something, you would also be zooming the viewport. I wanted to give a little bit of segue here because we have a lot of other presentations coming up that are going more in depth about this. But one presentation is just following this presentation right away is the presentation about advanced theming techniques. And because UI design has a lot to do with theming as well, this is a very useful talk for all the people that are interested to follow up. And to recap my presentation, I think if you're thinking about responsive design, the first step should always be to define so if you're starting to build an application, not converting an existing application, you should always think very hard what's your target group and what's the context of use that people will be using this application in, both desktop and mobile context of use, and because this will help you decide what kind of application or applications you're building. You should always think about cost versus benefit regarding this. So is it wise to go implement responsive application, or should you just stick with desktop or mobile only, or should you create two separate applications because maybe backend should be also different or not? So like I said, sometimes responsive is not the answer. Sometimes it's actually more cost-effective to just stay desktop or just mobile simply because context of use is not there. And you would be spending resources and development time on creating something that nobody will be using later. And always, when you're building an app and you decided that you want to build a responsive app, try to go mobile first. Design an app for a mobile phone or a tablet first before you scale it up and go desktop. But also, when you scale it up, you should always think of all the ways how can you utilize that extra space and extra preciseness that you gain in interaction. And so not just like scale everything up, but actually do something with that extra space. With that, I would like to thank you a lot for listening. And we still have about, I think, 10 minutes or so. So if there are any questions, I would be glad to take them. It's a little bit hard to see, so.
Yeah, hi, here. One small question. You mentioned about vector-based graphic. We should use vector-based graphic instead of fix, you know. You have an example of a vector-based graphic that would fit in all browsers and everything?
So SVG is supported basically in pretty much everything except IE8. So that's a problem. When you're dealing with older browsers like IE8, generally that you cannot go full vector because there's simply no solution. IE cannot deal with that. But for everything more modern, you can stick with either using SVGs only or using icon fonts if you're dealing with just very simple graphics. Because those are much better to scale up. And actually, Sencha Touch has been using icon fonts for a long time already. For IE8, simply, that support's not there. It's not going to come. So it's an advice really for more modern deployment. But for mobile devices, it should be a safe way to go.
Hey. We started to build a responsive application with XGS 5.1. So how different it's going to be with version 6? Because in XGS 5, all controls are actually desktop controls. So what would be a difference in how we're going to manage views if compared with version 6?
So ext5 to ext6, the main difference there is that second toolkit, which is like really mobile toolkit based on touch interaction. So everything that you build in ext5, not one, and that's responsive, that toolkit stays the same, and you can still use the same toolkit to deploy to tablets and to desktop. That toolkit's a little bit too heavy to be used effectively on mobile phones, simply because performance is not right there, but there are tons of other features that are supported. So if you upgrade to 6, you would basically have to recreate your views in the mobile toolkit, but your general infrastructure of your application, like all the stores, all the controllers, all the data models, that should generally stay the same. You just need to change your presentation there.
At which level there will be a cutoff? Like, for example, we have view model and view. Like, it will be at view model level, or it will be at controller level?
So don't quote me on this. There are better people here in Sencha that can answer that more precisely. But your view models and view controls should generally stay the same. Only your view should be different. Because you can reuse the data that's there in view model and view controller. The difference is, of course, if you're creating views that are radically different, you might require different functionality in them as well, which means you'll end up implement additional functions in your controller as well that might work only when you're using a specific view.
Yeah, technically that's the case, because after some research we decided to have a completely separate set of views for mobile application. What else? And I have one more question. Probably not familiar with it. In core package you have everything packed in it, like including UI level.
Can you repeat that? In core package, I have
we have XJS core package.
Yes.
And as far as I can tell, it's including everything, including all panels and components and everything like that. How in that case it will be compatible with mobile UI?
So you will get 2 different packages containing different components, one optimized for mobile, one optimized for desktop. So when you create a build, and if you're building a build just for desktop, it will just take the package and the views that you create for desktop and build your application with that. And same if you're building for mobile to use the other package and other views that you create.
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions?
Hello. You had an example for responsive layout where a rule says either you have HBox or VBox layout. Wouldn't it make sense to have a layout manager that is responsive in itself? Like you use the same layout, but the layout manager is responsive and has these rules built into it.
You mean, so how it works, like you use this responsive config in your view when you define, okay, this view contains this toolbar and these buttons and things like that. So in the config of toolbar, you would add the responsive config in there with all the configuration of what's going to happen to this particular toolbar when its viewport is changed. So the layout manager will pick that up and redraw things if the viewport has changed. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so, yes.
Okay. Maybe one last question before we close this session and go to the next one. No. Right, I would like to thank you once more for listening, and I hope you have a great time on the rest of the SanchaCon. If you're interested in teaming, I would really advise you to stay for the next session. It's going to be great. And thank you for being here.